You change hats very quick.
Yeah. Yeah. I see you're following me. Okay, good morning. Good morning. We are on page 142 in Hemshech Tzadik Daled. And we began learning chapter 30, but a little background here. Bottom line is that he's explaining how Tzva Ha'aretz and Tzva Shamayim, Shamayim and Aretz, heaven and earth, which means the heavenly bodies and the earthly creatures all tell us about God. But they tell us different elements of it. So we covered the Tzva Ha'aretz, basically reveal for us when Su'u Morem Einechem, when you lift your eyes upward and you contemplate on creation, you come to realize Mi Bara Ela, who created all of this, who created this, the divine providence in each detail of this volumnius, I don't know if it's the right word, the multitude of creatures in every detail. Achdus Hashem, as he explained, Hashem Echad, as I mentioned, Hashgacha Pratis, and it also tells us a little about the Bligvul, because the fact that it's Chayomim Bimin, it perpetuates in species. How could I ish a dover mugbal, like he said on the top of page 142? Like he says, Chayes alikia melubish b'chol nivra hu mugbal. Shar beguf mugbal ef sheshachash v'yibit mugvi. Imkein, there should have been a hefsek v'shinui, because gvul has a hefsek, an interruption and a change. That indicates that besides the chayes prati, besides the fact that there is a divine energy within existence, there's also yesh be'er v'chayes bli gvuli. Shekol zeh yedim gam mitzvah aretz. Then he concluded the last chapter on top of page 142. Omnom, this is going to be understood. Moving to musug yeser mitzvah shamayim. So now we're moving over to the story that Tzva Shamayim tell us, and as the Zohar says, and we learned on previous page, that it's not just a sipur, dvarim, it's a story, but it's also a ha'ara, elim denaharim, v'netzitzim b'netzitzu denahuri elah. It's also an illumination of the two sorts of illumination, er yosher ve'echezer, like we learned earlier. So now chapter 30 is dedicated to this. But he goes back again to Tzva Ha'aretz because they constantly interplay and interacting the contrast of the two. So what does he say here? I'm going to review what we learned yesterday. So he began with the Yerushalmi. On the Pasuk, Eila tel the Shashamayim Varas Be'ibaram. That means that Shamayim and the Galgalim and all the Tzva Maila, all the celestial bodies, the heavenly bodies, they're Kiyem Hibaram Mamish. Or later the Lashon is Chazakim Kiyem Hibaram. They're strong, exactly like day one. So not only do they perpetuate and go on and don't die, but they're as strong as in day one. So there's actually two chidushim here. One chidush is that something that's mugbal, that's limited, continues on. And the second thing is that it's as strong as it was day one. It doesn't even get weakened, which we're going to point out in a moment, those 2 points. The difference is that in that Tzva Ha'aretz, it's only Bemin, it's only the species, but the individual, absolutely. Every individual ish, let's say every human being or every creature, every animal, is always withering. From the beginning, it already is beginning to get weaker and weaker until the point that it perishes. But the species continues on. When it comes to Tzva Hashamayim, the individual, not only doesn't it perish, but it doesn't even get weaker. It remains as strong as day one, which is going to teach us, obviously, a deeper level of Bligvul, but I don't want to jump there. Let me just then sum up what we learned. So Chazakim Kiyem Hibaram. And now he explains. He goes back again. What's the chidush in this? What does this tell us? It's going to tell us that there's something going on here that's not natural. Remember, the whole point here is that the contemplation whether it's on the earthly creatures or on the heavenly bodies, is to tell us there's a force, a godly force that's higher than these creatures. Remember, this is all a type of an example in Aveda of the bittul, the second type of bittul and oir, that it feels that it's not an existence of its own. It's completely dependent on its source. So here the point is also this. He needs to demonstrate, we need to demonstrate, just a moment. Yeah. We need to demonstrate that that existence itself, when you contemplate on it, also tells you there's something and compels you to say there's something that's beyond the existence that creates and maintains and sustains and perpetuates that existence. That's why this is so vital, because we need to see if existence was on its own, it would have to diminish because it's a mugbal. So that's what he's going to explain now more at length. He already said at the top of the page, but more at length. Now, the key thing to remember, another thing to point out, I want to say is earlier on page 140 and 141, the top, but basically 140, there he was speaking that the difference between Tzva Aretz and Tzva Shamayim was like the difference between Chochmas HaMaisa and Chochmas HaNefesh. In other words, the Tzva Ha'aretz, the earthly creatures, are more mukhshi. They give you more of a tangible understanding in the creator's, the creative energy of creating art or something that's more Maisa. Chochmas HaMaisa, God's wisdom in the so-called the wisdom of the design of the universe. Whereas Tzva Shamayim give us more like Chochmas HaNefesh, a much more a taste of the sublime and the more ethereal nature of, so to speak, the Beta, the Eibishter. Here, we're going more deeper into that, even an understanding of the bligvul of Elokus, not just the gvul, which is a difference also between Tzva Shamayim and Tzva Aretz. There's also a difference in even the Chayis HaMugbal. There's a difference between the divine as it manifests in the Tzva Aretz and Tzva Shamayim. Here, clearly, he's going further, a higher level of understanding also the bligvul, which you have to say is there because you see the perpetuation of a nivra mugbal. To just give a simple example before I read on, before I summarize further, imagine you saw a stone flying. You didn't see someone throw the stone, you see a stone. Now, you know, and I know, that at some point the stone is going to fall. It's not going to fly forever. You see the stone flying. What do you learn from that? That somebody must have thrown it. Now, you know, because the person who threw it and the stone and the power koyach hazrika is limited, it's mugbal, at some point the stone's going to fall. That's a given in nature. What happens if you see the stone keeps flying and flying and flying and flying? You say, well, 1 second, that seems pretty miraculous, because where's the stone has such power to fly on and on? So you have to say that the one who threw it, or the one that's giving it that power, there's something stronger than just the kayach mugbal of a regular throwing of a stone. The same thing like this, when you see the perpetuation of the species of Tzva Ha'aretz, so yes, each creature perishes and dies, that makes sense. A mugbal is ultimately limited, and if it's limited, it's going to, like he said, there's going to be nechlash, v'nifsad, or the words hefsek and shinu, the different words for it. Now you look at Tzva Shamayim, so that tells you there must be something that's keeping the species going. But it's much stronger when you look at Tzva Shamayim. You suddenly see a sun and a moon and stars and planets, and they never change. They're constantly going through the same motion. You can predict exactly when it will rise, how they move in the sky, how they are orbiting, and you don't see any change. Not only don't they end, doesn't fall, it's constantly as strong as the moment that when it was so-called the stone is as strong in middle of its flight, just as it was at the beginning of its flight. So that has to tell you, that indicates that there's some deeper power here. That means that this mitzias is not of its own. This mitzias is a result of the beira, kayach habeira, the rotzen habeira, that wants it to have this type of perpetual strength. So it's al derech the oir, that's telling you that I don't exist on my own. My existence is due to a source. I'm just tying it up to there. We will talk more about this. I just wanted to not let ourselves get lost in the shuffle here as we're reviewing and learning this piece here. Okay. So now he goes on. After he says chazakim kiyemi baram, or kiyemi baram mamish, the language here means they are consistently strong, just as the day they were created. So he says, "V'hainu," and this is the chiddush, that even though tzva shamayim are also nivroim mugbalim, remember tzva shamayim, just like tzva aretz, are finite creatures. They're very large, but they're still finite. Umakovim meguv nefesh mugbal, and they are a composite of a guf and a nefesh mugbal. So they're made up of something that's defined. So I think the difference, nivroim mugbalim, means that their very being is mugbal. A sun has measurements, it's a size, it has properties, and so on. And then the guf and nefesh of the sun are also defined, are finite. And there's nothing about the sun and the moon, its properties, its physical properties, that make it less of a perishable creation than tzva aretz. So what does the sun have that a tree or an animal or a human being has? Nothing on its own. We're talking about as a matter of fact, science will tell you that a sun is made up of the different forces, hydrogen and oxygen, and helium, and then other elements. Those elements are basically elements that exist on Earth too. So in other words, there's nothing about the sun and the moon or the planets or tzva shamayim on their own that make them more so-called more bli gvul. They're gvul, and they are efshariya hefsid. In other words, if you looked at the elements that build them, they're subject to hefsid, to diminishment, to what you said, perishable. You could say it's depletion, erosion. There's a lot of word for hefsid. Hefsid here means, usually hefsid means loss, but here means they lose their vitality. They're subject to the changes and that cause something to weaken. Okay, and then he brings the klal hayadua, that kol ha'efsheri b'min, efshar shalayave, and if it's subject to such change, it's impossible. It's efshar. It's not possible that it won't happen. In other words, if something is subject to these rules, the rules of nature, at some point those rules will govern. So even if it's very strong right now, ultimately will be affected by the elements, so to speak. In this case, hefsid. And then he goes back to tzva aretz. And here's where it's not confusing, but I just wanted to put it in context. He goes back now, the same as with tzva aretz. The b'tzva aretz ma'achad the kavon el yenim behem. There, the difference is what the kavon el yena is. In other words, if you talked about there was no kavon el yena, or put that aside for a moment, there was no koyach habeira, there was no ratzon habeira. If you just looked at creation itself on its own, everything should be subject to diminishment and erosion and ultimately perishing. The difference is the kavon el yena changes things. So in tzva ha'aretz, the kavon el yena is that yufsadu b'seder the efen of seders the agashmi. That's what the Eibishter wanted, that they should be subject to the natural changes, which is, like he says, b'seder efen of seders agashmi, the natural process of erosion and deterioration of every natural entity. You know, you take a flower, right? You cut it off a tree. It's very fresh for a day or two. At some point, the elements of erosion and deterioration, it will wilt and dry up and die. That's the way creation was made. So the Hasidic Rebbe goes on. Hine levad zeis, talking about tzva aretz. Besides the fact that him nifsadim beish, besides the fact that they are nifsadim beish, which means that each individual is subject to this diminishment. Hinigam bezeh she'enim nifsadim. Even the fact that the species does not diminish, like his pirish, bezeh she'em kayomim b'min. No, it's even the element in the tzva aretz which does not diminish. What's that? The species. The species does not die. The species perpetuates. Hine mekol mokim harehem nechloshim. it's interesting what he's saying here. Now that I read it again, so the kayomim b'min, nevertheless, they get weakened. Does he mean that the species, even though it perpetuates, it continues to get weakened from generation to generation? No, you can't say that's what he means. In other words, he's saying that bottom line is, when you're talking tzva oretz, besides the fact that no individual creature lasts forever and everything weakens and dies, even the fact that the species continues does not mean that the creatures don't get weakened. They get weakened as well. Yeah, that's what he means. In other words, they don't just perish, they also get weakened, even though the general species continues on. The kolzeh, why is this the case? That's because the kavan el yena, that they should continue to be perpetuated in the species, does not change who they are. They fundamentally are subject to those changes because of sharia hesed. On their own, they are subject to what's the hefsed I said here, to diminishment and ultimate to perishing, to dying. So therefore, in every possible way, that's what happens. The only thing, the exception is that the species continues because that's what God wants. That tells you there's a force outside of them that does it. But everything else about them is because they're subject to change, to weakening, therefore they weaken and they die. What's the story with Tzva Shamayim? Remember, it still doesn't change the fact that Tzva Shamayim on their own are also subject to the same changes and same diminishments. But here the Kavan El Yen is different. Mashenkim b'Tzva Shamayim. In contrast, the heavenly bodies, Shakavan El Yen behem sheyiyu kayomim beish. Here the Kavan is that they should perpetuate individually. So he says, Hine af gam ime yese bali guf murgus v'efsharia hefsid, even though they too, just like the tzva haaretz, just like the earthly bodies, are also a bali guf murkav. They're made up of a body that's a composite, and it's subject to hefsid, to loss, to diminishment, to death, to ending. Mikol mokim, here goes the other, but the kavan el yena here has a different impact. So here's also a lezu b'lvad. Before the lezu b'lvad was not only does the individual perish, but it also weakens even though the species perpetuates. Here's the other way around. Since the kavan el yen is it should perpetuate as an individual, so besides the fact that each ish loy nedar, each individual loy nedar does not disappear, does not go away, behem, ela av gam zeh is the efen kiyumam. But additionally, not only does it not die, but it doesn't get weaker. Hu mashehem chazokim kiyem ibarim bli shum shinei v'hefsek klal. It doesn't even weaken. That's how powerful the bli gvul, the kavan el yena, changes the reality, the nature. So in tzva haaretz, the only shift is that it perpetuates in species, but besides that, everything dies and everything gets weaker. In tzva shamayim, it's also on its own subject to the same rules, but the kavan el yena is that everything should perpetuate and nothing should get weaker either. It's as strong as the moment it was created. So those are the two chidushim, so to speak, that come from the koyach and kavan el yena, the koyach habayda. Okay, this is where we stopped yesterday, but I felt I want to go over it again just to put it in structure. Umasha Omar Razal. And now he says, and what Razal say, Shit al fishnin have alma v'chad charuf. So this is a apparent question here. Chazal, the Gemara says that the Eibishter established the world for 6,000 years, Hava alma, the world should last for 6,000 years, 6 millennia, v'chad charuf, and the 7th millennia, 1,000 would be charuf. The whole thing would be destroyed, would come to an end. So here you see that there is a hefsid. It ultimately does come to an end. So in a way, you could ask a question: why are you telling me that it's a kayom and beish? It's only for 6,000 years. including the sun and the moon and the celestial bodies. The tzva ha'aretz, even within the 6,000 years, deteriorate and perish. But the species continues. But after 6,000 years, everything comes to an end. Chad charuv. Hare, the sof sof yufsadu. So we see from this that sof sof, at the end of the game, end of the story, yufsadu. They will disappear. They will no longer exist. So he says, here's an interesting twist. Hine have say this halazu, this diminishment, or I would say more than this perishing. He mitzad rotzen habeira. That's due to the rotzen habeira sheyiye kach. The desire of the Beira, of the creators, that's how he wanted it to be. V'hainu. Well, just let me explain before we're going to read inside. Basically, he's going to be saying creation on its own should have been constantly subject to diminishment and erosion and perishing. The Eibishter wanted it to have an element of bligvul. Tzva oretz in species, tzva shamayim in individual, and also no weakening. That same Ratzon Hashem that so-called introduced bligvul into creation also said, 1 second, I'm not giving you bligvul forever. It's designated for 6,000 years. I want it to be this way. In other words, the sun at the last day of the 6,000 years is as strong as day one. But that's it. Now your expiration date has come, and now it's all over. That's all part of Ratzon Hashem. In other words, it's not a contradiction. This is all part of God's plan. So he's going to say this now. He's going to say, "V'hainu, the hefsed zu, ma'ashe yufsedu bizman echad." This hefsed is that we're talking about chad charuv, that they will ultimately be annihilated in a bizman echad, all in one time. In other words, at the end of 6,000 years comes the expiration date, so to speak. Ein ze me'inyan hefsed is the heva v'nifsid. That's not a result of the natural erosion that all creatures are subject to. It's not like after 6,000 years they run out of energy. Because remember, that energy that perpetuated them was from Kavan El Yena, that was from God. So it's not like the sun burned out after 6,000 years, because all those years it was as strong as day one. So the fact that it ends at 6,000 years is not as a result of its natural erosion, because that was overridden by Ratzon Elyon, by Ratzon Habeira. She says it's not due to the fact, meaning I've said the Heva v'nifsid. Heva v'nifsid means kol Heva nifsid. Everything that exists is ultimately everything that has a beginning has an end, basically. Everything that has a beginning will have an end. It's not due to that. Ki I've said this the Heva v'nifsid who Hashem mereshis haviyusei mascheli lihifsed or lihifsed. How would you pronounce that? Maschil as a verb, how would you pronounce lehifosed, lehifsed, lehefsed?
Lehiposed.
Okay.
Lehiposed.
Yeah. So what is he saying? He's saying like this. Because if it was about the natural erosion, then from day one, it should be that way. This natural erosion, that existence, whether it's earthly or heavenly bodies, creatures, earthly creatures or heavenly bodies, that's from the beginning of its creation, from its beginning. It begins maskeli foster, like he says, like the Bechai writes, Rabbeinu Bechai, Shatinuk miyem hivolde maskeli isyavish. That a child, from the day he's born, he begins to dry up, he begins to age, he begins to diminish. You don't see it then, because a newborn child is just beginning. But he's subject to it, and therefore he begins that way. So if you're talking about the natural erosion that will lead to the end, the death of it, that then it begins right in the beginning. V'hainu sha'afseidus hitmidis. This means that the diminishment or the erosion or the ultimate, the death is an ongoing process. O canal, like we learned earlier, he says, Pedig Zayin, says the Rebbe, the kol inyan hamitzir shel hayesh who have said this halami, that the whole existence of the yesh is a concealed hafsedis. It's constantly in a state of weakening. But so therefore, this is all building a case that you cannot say after 6,000 years it's due to this natural weakening or this natural erosion. And it's going to continue. And the heavenly bodies that are as strong as the day they were created, and they're doing throughout their entire existence by the desire of God. They also don't have any shinui, change or weakening at all. They're exactly as strong as day one. Not like the child. Just as in the movement, in the orbit of the sun, the moon, and the spheres that we talked about. From the day, the fourth day of creation, when the Me'eris, when these luminaries were placed in heaven, were hung up in heaven, Nitla Me'eris, Ad Hayem, till this day, till this very day, Ein Shvehem Shinui, they have no change, they're exactly the same intensity, the same strength. Keinu B'Kecham. Also, this is also true about their intent, about their strength. The Kechem Atom. Okay, first of all, no, I should correct. Not this, the first half is not the strength. That their very being is exactly the same. The sun is exactly the same sun as it was back 5,781 years ago. Also, their strength did not get depleted. The Kechem Ata Kechem Oz. Their power and their intensity and strength now is exactly as it was then. So this proves that when at the end of 6,000 years, it's not due to the natural erosion, it's due because that's what God wants. That's what he's going to say now. Harizeh. So now we know, from this we conclude, Asher lo osid love, that in the future, which he's referring to the seventh millennia, page 143, that the fact that Asher lo osid love yufsadu, that in the future, in the seventh millennia, they will disappear. They will cease to be. This, and the end of their being, at the end of 6 millennia, is not hefsedis in the sense of the natural erosion of something. But rather, this is due to the fact that this is the desire of God, the creator, Hamakayim, that sustains them. And as soon as the ratzon is that they should no longer be, they automatically cease to be. So it's all about a force outside of them. The force outside of them gives them a perpetuation where they don't change and they're as strong as they were day one. And that same force outside of them says, now it ends. That so-called gift, that blessing or that power that I invested in you, now has come. It is expired. It has nothing to do with you. It's not you. You weren't sustained on your own, and you didn't stop on your own. That's what he's basically saying. So that natural erosion that every creature is subject to is being bypassed here. That exists in Tzva Oretz, but in Tzva Shamayim, it's all controlled by a higher force. The higher force gives it that equal intensity that does not weaken, does not die. And that same force comes a point, and that's it. I only did this for you for 6,000 years. That's the time. And then it stops. Not because you're weak, but because I don't want it anymore. Till now I wanted it, now I don't. Okay. Any questions before I continue here? No? Okay, good. So now he says, V'zeu diksiv. I just want to point out before we continue. There's a few footnotes from the Rebbe here that I'll just point out. On the Bechai, the Rebbe never found, where is this Bechai? Where's the actual Bechai? So the Rebbe writes, Ulai HaKavona, if you look at the third footnote on page 142, he says, maybe the Kavona, the intention is to what it says in Bechai and the Pasuk, Bereshis Aleph Chav Ches, 128. If you look there, you're not going to find this exact language. It's implied there. But bottom line, we have not found exact language where the Bechai says, Tinuk, a child, from the moment it's born, it begins to so-called erode or dry up or diminish. Just that's one footnote. Then there's a longer footnote, which if you want, I can read it and learn it inside. Basically, the Rebbe brings, where do we have the source that from the day the sun and moon and the heavenly bodies were hung, so to speak, were placed into the heavens, they are exactly the way without any change. So the Rebbe cites here in the footnote that there's a source for it, but there's also midrashim that say otherwise. You want me to read that? It's up to you guys. Yeah, why not? It's a footnote from the Rebbe, might as well, okay? So I'll just do this. You'll see it goes on to the next page. I'll do it quickly. You'll see. This is classic, the Rebbe explaining this. So he says, Rei Yerushalmi Reish Brachas Hanal. Look at Yerushalmi in the Hanal, the one, remember the beginning of the chapter was Yerushalmi Brachas, that the creation is as strong as the day it was created. So he says, look there. And the Rebbe in the parentheses, V'chein hu gam beBreishis Rabbah Parsha Yud Beis Yud Gimel. The same idea is stated in Breishis Rabbah, Medrash Rabbah 12:13. Asher teldes hashamayim. And the Rebbe quotes, this is an actual quote from Yerushalmi, that teldes hashamayim, meaning the creatures of heaven, the heavenly creatures, or the heavenly offspring, to be more precise, b'chol shah v'shah heinirin kishas yitzikosan. Every hour, meaning every moment, they appear exactly, the Rebbe underlines, emphasizes kishas yitzikosan. Yitzikosan means when they were first shaped, they were first poured. Yitziko is when you like take gold, you pour, and then it hardens. So it's an expression of when they were first formed or shaped or created. So that's what it says there. So this is clear proof to what he says in the Maimer, that every hour they're exactly as they were when they were first shaped and formed. Umoisif al zeh Rabbi Zaria. And Rabbi Zaria in Yerushalmi adds to this, Asher. So here goes a quote again. Yem nichnas v'yem yetza, Shabbos nichnas v'Shabbos yetza. A day comes, v'yem yetza, a day goes, a day passes. Yem nichnas means a day arrives. V'yem yetza, a day leaves, means a day passes. Shabbos nichnas v'Shabbos yetza, Shabbos comes and Shabbos goes. B'hibaram b'yem aseis Hashem elikim at eretz u'shamayim. And it's like in the day of creation when God first placed and created earth and heaven. Hainu, the Rebbe explains this because there are mefarshim, as you'll see in a moment, that what does this mean? What does the Yerushalmi mean? A day comes, a day goes. So the Rebbe explains, Hainu, this means, Shagam Eifen Hiluch Teldes Hashamayim. This is explaining according to the Maimer. The Maimer, remember, said that the heavenly bodies, that besides the fact they have that till this day there's no change, that they were the same intensity, they're hilucham. In other words, they're koyach. I'm sorry. The kashem should be in hilucham shal shamish, that their orbit is exactly as it is without shinui, the orbit. Same thing as with their intensity. So the Rebbe is saying the hiluch, that's what it's coming to say, that the hiluch of Teldes HaShamayim means the movement and the orbit of the heavenly bodies. And that is dependent, the flow of day and week. How does the day and the night come? It's due to the orbit of the sun and the moon. And same thing with the week. Every day, the sun and moon, 7 days later comes Shabbos. So how are the days established? The day that comes and the day that goes, it's established by the hiluch, by the orbit. So the Rebbe is saying that the Frierdiker Rebbe's word in the Maimer is actually explaining the Yerushalmi. Lo nishtan v'nechlesh klal. This orbit, and therefore the result of it, which is the flow of day and night, or day after day and week after week, Shabbos after Shabbos, does not change and doesn't get weakened at all. They're the same as they were when they were created, in the day God formed, God created them. And the Rebbe adds in a parenthesis, Ulechinam nitchaku, hamafarshim bekavonos divrei Rabbi Azariah. And for no reason, the Mefarshim are struggling and trying to understand what Rabbi Azariah says. In other words, the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maimer explains Rabbi Azariah in Yerushalmi that the Hiluch affects the days and the Shabbos, and the Mefarshim, based on this, you don't need the whole challenge. Nitchaku means they're trying to, nitcha is when they're struggling with it and trying to find some way to explain what Rabbi Azariah says. The Rebbe says there's no need for that. Chinam. Chinam means it's there was no reason for them to do that. Now the footnote continues on the next page. So the Rebbe says now, V'hinei, B'Breishis Rabbah Parsha Yudalad. In another medrash, it says, B'Breishis Rabbah 10:4, Dorash Rav Elfas. Rav Elfas learned the Hamazolas Hoyu, the Mazolas, which means again the heavenly stars, Hoyu Mahalchin Derech Tzora, their orbit was a short orbit, Uba Mehirus, and a quick one, a short and quick orbit. Mishachata Adam Arishan. From the time that Adam Arishan sinned, Sivavon Derech Arucha Uba Mesinus. The Eibishter caused that the Eibishter should change their orbit, that it should go far longer orbit and slower. Mesinus means more patient, but it means slower. So what do you see from this? That there is a change in their orbit. The Yerushalmi and the first Medrash Rabbah, that Beis Rabbah, there's no change, exactly as it was day one. And here he says there's a change. So the Rebbe says, Al Korchach Tzarech Lemer, the Medrashas Chalukis Hein. You have to therefore say that the Medrashas, that there's a disagreeing Medrashim. The Medrashim disagree about this. Then two more paragraphs in the footnote. Ube Pirkei Rabbi Lezer Perek Zayin. Another medrash. Pirkei Rabbi Lezer chapter 7. Brachas, and the Gemara Brachas, Nun Tes Beis 59b. The Rebbe writes, Ayin Sham Bepirish Rashi. Look there in Rashi. Teisvus Dibra Maschel L'Tkufis. And also Teisvus and L'Tkufis in the Gemara Rosh Hashanah Ches Aleph 8a. Rambam Hilchus Kiddush HaChedesh Perek Tes Halacha Gimel. A bunch of footnotes, a bunch of sources. The Rambam in Kiddush HaChedesh chapter 9 Halacha 3. Ubekama Rishenim, and a number of Rishenim. Muchach de loy nishtane hiluch hachama v'alavana. There it's clear, muchach. You must say that the orbit and the movement of the sun and the moon does not change. Ubeshita kishita say Yerushalmi, and that's like the shita of the Yerushalmi that we cited before. That's not like udeloi kamedrash Bereishis Rabbah, and not like the Bereishis Rabbah that the Rebbe cited in the chapter before from Rav Efes, that Mazolas did go through a change after the sin of the tree of knowledge. Then the Rebbe finally says, Ulahoyer in the parentheses, Meyores Dvosh, that's the Yavitz. Yores Dvosh is a sefer of droshes from Rabbi Yonason Eibshitz, not the Yavitz, not from Rabbi Yonason Eibshitz, I believe. Yeah. Chelik Aleph, Drush Aleph, Drush Tezvov. In the first section, in the first Drush and the 15th Drush, the Rebbe doesn't say what it says there. I haven't looked it up. I'll look it up and let you know. And the Rebbe says, Ve'ein meshiven ala Drush. There's an expression that you don't necessarily try to explain or answer or on Drush. Drush is not really subject to contradictions, because when you say a drush, it's not like a source that says, okay, here's one opinion, here's another opinion, like the Medrash and the Yerushalmi. Drush, you can say many different drushes on something, and you don't necessarily see that as a contradiction. The Rebbe is just citing it. It appears from when you read it that probably he says something about the change of the movement, but the Rebbe says Ein Meshivim, which means it doesn't change our pshat here. And then the Rebbe concludes Ve'ein Kama Keme. And here's not the place to elaborate on this. Okay, there you have a footnote from the Rebbe on the Frierdiker Rebbe on this Maimer. Let me continue now in the actual text on page 143, line 2. So we've established that the diminishment and the perishing or the annihilation or the end of Tzva Shamayim, the heavenly bodies at the end of 6 millennia, has nothing to do with their natural being subject to the natural erosion and changes of the elements of creation. It's only due because that's what God wants. He wanted them to have a type of bligvul perpetuation, and then that wanted it for 6,000 years, and then that stops. V'zeu diksiv, and this is what it says. The Rebbe gives the footnote, Yeshaya Nun Aleph Vav, 51:6. Su'ul shamayim einechem. Lift your eyes to heaven. Remember, before we said su'ul the morim, su'ul morim einechem. There the word was morim, upward. Here it says su'ul shamayim einechem. Lift your eyes to heaven, the habitu ela oretz mitochas, and gaze at the earth below, mitochas, below the heaven. Ki shamayim ka'oshan nimlachu. Because the heaven, nimlachu would be, nimlachu, they were shaped like ka'oshan, like a cloud. In other words, earth is made up of solids, and heaven is far more ethereal in the sense like Oshan. Oshan is smoke. Cloud. Onon is a cloud, but Oshan is smoke, like smoke, I should say. Or Pirish Rashi, and Rashi says there. The Rebbe says in the footnote, the Pirushe, because I guess it doesn't say this in Rashi. The Rebbe corrects and says maybe it should say de pirushe, that the meaning in this is the hagam shem chazokim kiyemi boram, that even though the heavens and the heavenly creatures are as strong as they are, as the way they were created, in the day they were created, I should say, they're as strong as the day they were created, like we learned before. Hine bevei harotzen, when the rotzen arrives, meaning when the rotzen emerges. Literally, this means when we're dealing with Voya Rotzen, that when we look to the desire of Hashem, sheyufsadu, that they should be diminished, they should cease to be, that they should yufsadu, they should be erased, if you wish. Yufsadu berega echad. They disappear. Disappear is also a good word. Yufsad can be the word disappear. That they disappear in 1 second. In other words, it's not a process, because it's not subject to erosion. God wanted it to perpetuate, and now when the Ratzon comes, not that, when the Ratzon arrives, it's in a moment. Now, how do we learn that from the Pasuk? I assume it's from the word ka'oshan, being that it's like smoke, so it doesn't have any substance of its own. So as soon as the Ratzon doesn't want it anymore, it just disappears. I'm trying to understand the pshat. I need to look up the pasuk, and since it's not Rashi, as the Rebbe says, that's what it sounds like. I think I may have mistranslated the word nimlachu. What's nimlachu? It could be that the shamayim, like smoke, gets scattered. That could be nimlachu, more like scattered. I said it was shaped. I need to look it up, unless somebody has the pshat. It sounds like this pasuk is proof that it's not that the heavens, as soon as the time comes, they just disappear. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure how you learn it from this pasuk. Okay, I'll look it up in Yeshaya. I'll get back tomorrow about this. Oh, tomorrow there's no class. Well, the next class we have. Okay. Move on. Now, from this itself, is understood the Eifin Kiyumam Ata. Now he's concluding the whole piece, that their manner of being sustained and perpetuated now is not due to them. It's hu bekeach bli gvuli. It's with a bli gvul, an infinite power, that's giving them that power to perpetuate and to not get diminished and to be as strong as they were day one. Because when and this keach bli gvuli hamachayo mekayim oisam tamid, that energizes and sustains them tamid, on an ongoing basis, obviously till after 6,000 years. Okay. Tehine, any questions? Oh, okay.
Yes, I have a question. If I'm learning this correctly from what you're saying, it seems like this is a direct contradiction to the current scientific knowledge that orbits do change, stars do explode and do get destroyed, even now in our time before the 6,000 years. That there is change in the Tzava Shemaim in a lot of ways. Orbits change, which I read about. That's clear. They say clear scientific knowledge today. Very minor, but they do change. Planets are constantly, and stars are constantly dying and being changing. So how do we understand that? We just put that science aside, just say that the Rebbe's truth is truth, and that they, for somewhere, I don't understand that there is no change until the 6,000s here, or the beginning of the 7,000s.
Okay, I did speak about this when we started the topic a few days ago. I'll elaborate. Good question. So let me elaborate. No, it's a good question. So first of all, let's make this clear. This is not the Rebbe's Chiddush. It's a clear Yerushalmi and Medrashim that we just read. So it's straight Gemara. It's not the Rebbe's Chiddush. The Rebbe Friedrich Rebbe is explaining it. And the Rebbe in the footnotes is giving the sources. So let's just make that clear. So we're talking about the Yerushalmi, the Medrashis Rabbah, etc. And he brings also the whole section here, Pirkei Rabbi Elazar, Brachas, Tosfos, Rambam, clearly that there's no change. I would break it apart into a few parts. So listen, there's wherever possible that we don't need to make a disagreement between science and Torah, by all means, as long as we're not apologetic and we're not trying to change Torah. So if there's a place where you can find some way to explain both and they work together, great. So I'll try to do that a bit. And let's see if there's some things that remain discrepancy. As we all know, the Torah is ultimately Torah Emes. But so first of all, I don't think it's a contradiction to the stars that are born and die, because he doesn't say here that every one of the Tzva Shamayim. God could want that some things should be subject to the natural flow. What we know for sure that he's talking about here is sun, moon, and obviously certain, I doesn't say planets, Galgalim. Remember, I don't know if you were here, even the Galgalim, the concept of Galgalim is not accepted in modern science. They see it as a primitive Greek idea. And but let's not talk about that for a moment. Let's talk about the sun and the moon would be really the biggest important thing, because that's where that affects the day and night and so on. So the fact that throughout the solar system, there are stars that collide and stars that die out, my answer would be, is there's some things in Tzva Shamayim that God allowed and did not necessarily insist on putting his koyach habligvul. So then they're subject to the laws of nature. Like we said, even according to the Maimer here, he doesn't say the sun and moon are eternal. He says they're actually not eternal, and God is causing them to be that way. So that's one thing, that you could explain different shifts in the solar system and the solar systems and not contradict. The question would really be about the sun and the moon and the Tzva Shamayim that I guess we relate to more. So first of all, I'm not aware, I didn't look into it, so I'm not speaking from science. Do they say that days are getting shorter by just a drop? I'm not talking about the summer, winter, which is the annual cycle. That's all part of the cycle. That overall, I know science says that the sun is getting weaker and will ultimately burn out in a few billion years. I know that. But I would explain that, if I may, in this way. Because science doesn't work with God. Science is trying to look at the sun. It looks at it like a big furnace, And at some point, its fuel is going to run out. So based on that, based on the natural rules that everything runs out of fuel, which is, of course, the natural element, and you're not bringing koyach habeira into it, you can make the argument, yes, if it was only due to that. But since we learn in Torah that God infused the sun with some type of power, infinite power, that is not subject to how much fuel it has, you could also reconcile that. The scientists are talking from their observation, and not necessarily they appreciate. Remember, after 6,000 years, no scientist says that the sun is burning out in 200 years from now. When does Shit Al Fishnin end? We're now Tavshin Pei Aleph. So we're talking about 200 and some years. So I don't think any scientist says that. So you may never be able to know. My question would be, can scientists prove without a doubt that the sun itself is weaker today than it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago? Or it's a theory. In other words, we know that the temperatures are actually rising. So that's not a proof. But they'll say that's due to climate change or the ozone layer. So is there actual proof besides the logic? Of course, a car runs on gas. So obviously, when you fill the car with gas, it's full. But there's a point where it'll be half full, quarter full, then it'll be empty. So based on that logic, every scientist would say the sun is the same thing. It just has a lot more fuel. That lasts billions of years in their language. But do they actually have a proof that the sun is weaker today than it was 1,000 years ago? Or they'll say the shifts are so minute that we're talking over billions of years. So then I don't see necessary contradiction. All they're talking about is their logic. We have the additional knowledge that God implanted in the sun and the moon and the Tzva Shamayim, something eternal in it. And no scientist can disprove that. So that would be my response to this. But I'm not trying to in any way debunk science. I think science can only go with their logic. Science does not bring in koyach habligvul. They can't talk, just like a scientist cannot tell you what happened before the Big Bang. Who put that first ball of gas there? They will say, from the ball of gas till here, I can give you an explanation. But everyone comes back to the question, what was there before it all? So many scientists will tell you, you know what, that's outside of my domain, that's metaphysics, etc. That would be the way I would explain it. And one more thing I want to say, I mentioned that there's a letter from the Rebbe to the Ragan Shover, printed in Igros Kodesh, volume 1. It's one of the first letters. He asked the Ragan Shover, can you please gather together all the Torah theories on the Torah Shita on astronomy, all this, and reconcile it with the scientific approach. He asked the Ragan Shover that, but the Ragan Shover, we don't have a record of the Ragan Shover responding or ever doing that. So you see that the Rebbe was sensitive to this issue. They say the Rebbe was a very big astronomer in many ways. You know, they say even as a young man, they saw all kinds of charts, predictions of eclipses and so on, besides being a brilliant man. But it seemed that the Rebbe definitely dabbled and was immersed in astronomy. You could see it even from this footnote that he really did research on the Torah view. So so to sum up, I think there are many things that you don't need to make a contradiction. And the areas that still remains perhaps irreconcilable, which I don't really see the reason to do that, then obviously, you know, science does not know everything. And that's how it is. That would be my explanation, Eliezer.
So I'm just looking at a post from NASA. It does say that they've made calculations that the sun loses about 5.5 million tons of mass every second, or about 174 trillion tons of mass every year. So according to their calculation, there is to our sun, not to your answer about the other that it applies. But I thought the whole idea was that it applies not only to the whole Tzva Shemayim, but also to individual ones, that there's no change. So you're saying that? No,
but I could see certain stars where God says, you know what, I have no problem with them dying out. That I could see. That's not a problem. But the NASA statistic you just read,
yes,
is there proof of that?
I don't know. I didn't look into it enough.
Okay. Anyway, I said what I said. Listen, if there's a place that there's a contradiction, so be it. I mean,
right. Okay.
Okay, let's stop here. So middle of page 150, the top of 140.